He gave his Medal of Honor to a crying boy in the park, not knowing that simple act would change that boy's future forever. The park was always quiet in the late afternoon, just the sound of rustling leaves and branches creaking under the weight of time. On a weathered wooden bench near the far corner, an old man sat in silence. His name was Henry. He was over 70. His shirt was worn, and a black cap with the word veteran rested tirely on his head. But what stood out the most was a faded silver metal clip to his chest pocket. It no longer shone like it used to, but it still caught the sun at the right angle. Every afternoon, he sat there, not speaking, just watching the sky or the sparrows fluttering between the trees. He wasn't waiting for anyone. Not really. Just waiting for something, or maybe someone, until one day, a boy stood at the end of the park path. He didn't speak, just stared. The boy looked about 12 years old. Thin. His right shoe had a hole near the toe. He looked hesitant, but the curiosity in his eyes was too strong to hold back. For 3 days, the boy came to park. He stood in the same spot, watched Henry, then walked away. Henry didn't greet him. He only nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the silent visits. But on the 4th day, the boy finally approached. "Hi, is that a real war medal?" he asked softly. Henry raised his head slowly, blinked once, and nodded. "Yes, a medal for something I'd rather not remember." The boy sat at the far end of the bench. His hands clutched his knees. "I've never seen one before," he whispered. "My name's Caleb." Henry didn't reply right away. He just stared ahead at a tree, then said, "I'm Henry." They didn't say anything else that day. But the next afternoon, Caleb came back. And again, the next. Bit by bit, their conversations began to grow, like grass finding cracks in the pavement. Henry began to share his story, about being 22 and shipped off to war, about nights full of explosions and days filled with fear, about friends who never made it home. "This medal," he said, touching the dull piece of metal on his chest, "was given to me for saving 3 soldiers in a firefight. But I lost my best friend. His name was Joe. He was shot just 2 meters away from me. I was too late." Caleb stayed silent. He didn't know what to say, but his eyes said enough. "Why do you keep coming here?" Henry asked. Caleb bit his lip. "Because at school, they say I'll never be anything. At home, I'm just a burden. But when I see that medal, I think, maybe someone like me could matter too." Henry turned to look at him. His gaze was soft, but deep. "Someone like you," he said, "could matter more than you'll ever know." That evening, the sun slipped gently through the trees. Birds returned to their nests. And on that worn-out bench, an old veteran and a lost boy shared a quiet that words couldn't touch. But Henry knew one thing. This boy wasn't like the others. And something inside him stirred. A thought, a choice, something he knew he could only give to one person. Caleb didn't tell Henry everything. Not yet. But the truth lingered in the way he walked, in the way his shoulders curved forward, in the quietness that clung to his words. At school, Caleb was invisible, not because he wanted to be, but because people chose not to see him. His classmates mocked him for his shoes, for his unbrushed hair, for the way he never raised his hand in class. Teachers often overlooked him. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't ask for help, because help never came. At home, things weren't much better. His aunt, the only family he had left, spent most of her time lying in bed. Her breathing was weak. Her medicine was always nearly empty. And the cupboards, more often than not, were bare. Caleb had learned how to survive on dry toast and cold water. He never complained. He just existed. But something changed when he started visiting the park, when he started talking to Henry. Henry never pitied him. He never asked what was wrong at home or why Caleb looked so thin. He didn't look at him the way teachers did, with tired eyes and forced smiles. Henry looked at him like he was someone worth listening to, someone with something to say. One cloudy afternoon, Caleb showed up to the park with red eyes and trembling hands. He sat down slowly. Henry didn't ask what was wrong. He simply handed the boy a warm sandwich wrapped in paper. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Caleb spoke. "I got into a fight today," he said quietly. Henry nodded. Did you win? No, Caleb said, almost laughing through his pain. But I didn't run either. That's better than winning, Henry replied. That's braver than most. Caleb looked at him. They said I'm worthless. That even if I disappeared, nobody would care. Henry clenched his jaw. His hands gripped the wooden bench tighter. Then, with a heavy breath, he unpinned a medal from his chest pocket. He held it out. Caleb looked at it like it was something sacred. I can't take that. Henry shook his head slowly. This medal was given to me for doing something right in the worst moment of my life. But I've worn it for too long. Maybe it's time someone else carries it. Not as a trophy, but as a promise. A promise. Henry nodded. That you'll never let yourself believe what they say. That you'll remember. Worth isn't something they decide. It's something you prove by standing when everything tells you to fall. Caleb took the medal. It felt heavy in his hands. He stared at it for a long time, then nodded once. Okay. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just held the medal close to his chest. That day, he walked home a little straighter. His shoes were still torn. His stomach still empty. But something inside him had changed. A tiny flicker of fire, barely visible but burning. The next morning, Caleb did something he never dared to do before. He brought the medal to school. He didn't wear it, not proudly, not yet, but he kept it in his pocket, wrapped in a small cloth. His fingers touched it again and again during class, like a silent reminder that he was no longer alone in this world, that someone, somewhere believed in him. But middle school is not kind of different, and especially not kind of boys like Caleb. During lunch, a group of boys cornered him near the back fence of the schoolyard. Their ringleader, Mason, smirked as he saw the cloth sticking out of Caleb's pocket. What's that? Mason asked. Nothing, Caleb replied, stepping back. But Mason was faster. He yanked the cloth out and revealed the medal. The boys gasped, at first in surprise, then in mockery. What is this? A toy, one of them laughed. No, Mason said, turning the medal over in his hands. He probably stole it, or bought it from a thrift store. What kind of loser carries a fake medal around like it means something? Caleb's heart thudded in his chest. He reached forward to grab it back, but Mason tossed it over his head like a frisbee. The other boys burst into laughter. The medal clattered against the concrete, spinning before it stopped at Caleb's feet. He bent down slowly, picked it up with both hands, and stared at the scratch that now cut across its surface. For a moment, he felt the tears building behind his eyes. He wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. The old voices returned. You're nothing. You don't matter. You never will. But then he remembered Henry's voice. Quiet, steady, firm. Worth isn't something they decide. It's something you prove by standing when everything tells you to fall. Caleb closed his hand tightly around the medal and stood tall. I didn't steal this, he said firmly. It was given to me by someone who matters, someone who fought in a war and survived while his friends didn't. And he thought I was strong enough to carry it, not to show off, but to remind myself that I'm more than what people say I am. The boys went quiet. For the first time, Mason didn't have a comeback. He scoffed, shoved his hands in his pockets, and walked away. The others followed. Caleb was left alone. But this time, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like space, like room to breathe. That night, he sat by the kitchen window with a pencil and a torn notebook. He didn't know why, but he began to write about the park, about Henry, about the way a stranger's belief felt stronger than all the voices that had tried to crush him. The words came slowly at first, but then they flowed. Raw, honest, real. He didn't know it yet, but those words would someday be read by thousands. Days turned into weeks. Caleb returned to the park every afternoon, just like before. He carried the medal in his pocket, never wearing it, never flaunting it. He didn't need to. The weight of it was already inside him. But something was wrong. The bench near the trees, where Henry always sat, was empty. On the first day, Caleb thought maybe the weather had kept him away. The second day, he waited longer. By the third, a quiet dread crept in. And by the fourth, he started asking strangers in the park, people who might pass by often enough to notice. An older woman with a stroller paused when he asked. She sighed softly. "The man with the hat? The veteran?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "I think the ambulance took him about a week ago," she said. "He collapsed right there on that bench." Poor soul. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the chest. He stood frozen, unable to think or speak. The sounds of the park blurred around him. The laughter of children, the barking of a dog, the wind rushing through trees. It all faded beneath the sudden silence in his ears. He ran to the bench and sat down, his fingers tracing the old wood grain, remembering every word, every silence, every lesson. Henry had never talked about being sick. He never said goodbye. And yet, somehow this felt like one. That evening, back at home, Caleb placed the metal carefully into a wooden box. On the inside of the lid, he taped a small note in his own handwriting. "He believed in me when no one else did. I won't waste it." From that night forward, he wrote every day, pages and pages. Sometimes stories, sometimes poems, sometimes just thoughts. But they all carried the same heartbeat. The memory of an old man in a park who had every reason to stop believing in the world and didn't. Months later, Caleb created a small blog. He uploaded one of his pieces, titled "The Man with the Medal." It was simple, just a story. No flashy design, no promotion. But people began to read. Then they began to share. Then the blog went viral. Hundreds of comments poured in from strangers who saw themselves in Caleb's pain. Teachers, veterans, students, even single parents. People from all walks of life. They connected to the honesty, the courage, the transformation of a forgotten boy. But no one knew who the boy was. Caleb kept his name hidden. He didn't want recognition. He wanted the words to speak for themselves. One gray afternoon, the postman left a large white envelope on Caleb's doorstep. It was thicker than usual. His name was printed neatly on the front, and in the top corner, a golden crest shimmered faintly. Caleb didn't recognize the symbol. But as he tore the envelope open with trembling hands, a single word on the top of the letter made his breath catch. Columbia University. The letter wasn't a bill. It wasn't junk. It was a personal message, written by a professor from the Department of Literature. They had found his blog. They had read The Man with the Medal, and they wanted to offer him a full scholarship, room, board, tuition, all covered. They believed his writing had a rare emotional clarity and timeless voice. They wanted him to come to New York, to study, to write, to grow. For a moment, Caleb just stood there in the hallway, silent. Then he sank to the floor, hands clutching the pages, eyes wide with disbelief. He whispered, "Henry, we did it." He ran to his room, pulled out the wooden box from under his bed, and opened the lid. The medal still lay inside, just as he had left it. The note was still taped inside the cover. "He believed in me when no one else did. I won't waste it." He traced his finger along the words. This wasn't just a letter. It was a door, one he never thought he'd be invited to walk through. That night, he wrote a new piece for his blog. A quiet thank you, not to the university, not to the readers, but to the man on the bench, to the one who gave him something more valuable than education, or medals, or fame, belief. And though Henry never replied, never commented, and never returned to the park, Caleb kept writing. Every word he typed felt like a conversation they never got to finish. 2 months later, he boarded a bus bound for New York City. The city roared outside the windows, tall and endless. But Caleb didn't feel small anymore. He clutched his backpack tight, the medal tucked safely in its inner pocket, next to his notebook. And for the first time in his life, the world felt like it was waiting for him. New York was nothing like the small Texas town Caleb had left behind. The streets were loud, fast, unforgiving. The buildings stretched into the clouds like monuments to ambition. For the first few weeks, Caleb felt like a ghost drifting through something far too big for him. But inside his dorm room, bare, quiet, and cold, he had something that felt familiar. A desk, a chair, a window, and a box. The same wooden box, worn at the edges, sat beside his books. The medal remained inside, wrapped in the same cloth Henry had once folded so carefully. Caleb opened it every night before he slept, not to admire it, but to remind himself why he was here. University life was hard. His classmates were smarter, louder, richer. They used words he didn't understand and referenced books he'd never heard of. Caleb often sat in the back row, scribbling silently in his notebook while the rest of the class debated philosophy and theory. But while others chased prestige, Caleb chased truth, and that truth poured into his writing. His professors began to notice. There was something in his essays, a rawness, a heartbeat. His stories didn't sound like polished fiction. They sounded like someone bleeding onto the page. Late at night, when the campus went quiet, Caleb wandered to libraries. He read books he couldn't afford back home, war memoirs, letters between soldiers, journals from survivors. One day, he found a yellowing book of Vietnam veteran stories. On the third page, there was a name he recognized. Henry Lowell. He sat frozen. The passage described Henry's bravery, his medal, the rescue of 3 injured comrades in a jungle ambush. And it mentioned a footnote, Henry's lifelong silence after the war, the death of a friend named Joe, his refusal to speak to press or attend ceremonies. Caleb swallowed hard. This wasn't just a man with a medal. Henry was a ghost who had carried his pain for decades, only to hand it over, gently, quietly, to a boy sitting alone on a park bench. Caleb closed the book, returned to his dorm, and wrote a letter. He addressed it to the Veterans Care Home listed in the book's appendix. He didn't know if it was still valid, didn't know if Henry would ever read it, but he wrote it anyway. Dear Henry, I'm in New York now, studying what you told me to keep doing, writing. I carry the medal every day, not to show off, but to remember who I want to become. Thank you for not giving up. On yourself, or me, I'll make it count. I promise. He sealed the letter, placed it gently in an envelope, and mailed it the next morning. And just like that, the ghost felt a little closer. The city felt a little quieter. And Caleb's fire burned a little brighter. 3 years passed. Caleb was no longer the invisible boy with torn shoes. He had become something else entirely. Quietly, steadily, and without fanfare, his writing had spread beyond the university. He had published essays, short stories, and a small collection titled Weight of a Medal. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached the people it needed to reach. Veterans wrote to him. Teachers assigned his stories in class. And young people, those who felt invisible like he once did, found pieces of themselves in his words. Then one day, an invitation arrived. He had been selected to speak at the National Forum for Youth Empowerment, a large event in Washington, D.C., attended by students, educators, and even government officials. His professors were thrilled. His classmates congratulated him. But Caleb hesitated. He had never spoken to a crowd. He wasn't a performer. He was a writer. But then, late at night, as he sat by the window with the wooden box beside him, he reached inside and held the medal again. He could almost hear Henry's voice. Worth isn't something to decide. It's something you prove by standing when everything tells you to fall. And so, he stood. On the day of the event, Caleb walked onto a wide, brightly lit stage. The auditorium was packed. Cameras were rolling. Screens displayed his name. He stepped to the microphone. No notes, no teleprompter, just a medal hanging around his neck. Faintly scratched, slightly dulled, but impossibly bright under spotlight. He began to speak, not about awards, not about scholarships, but about a bench in a quiet park, about a man with a bent back, a tired smile, and a war behind his eyes. He told the audience about the day the medal was handed to him, not as a reward, but as a reminder that even a forgotten child could carry something sacred. That belief can be passed down like a flame, and that the smallest act, like sitting beside someone, like listening, can change a life completely. By the time he finished, the auditorium was silent, the kind of silence that holds tears. That carries weight. Then applause, not polite, not forced, but rising. crashing. Real. Somewhere in the crowd, someone stood, an old man, leaning on a cane, with a cap pulled low over his eyes. Caleb saw him, and for a brief second, the boy and the veteran looked at each other from across a sea of people. Neither one spoke, but they didn't have to. After the speech, Caleb was swarmed by people. Students asking questions, organizers shaking his hand, even journalists requesting interviews. But his eyes kept drifting back to the seat where he had seen the man in the veteran cap. It was empty now. He made his way to the back of the auditorium, scanning every row. But the man was gone. Caleb stepped outside into the chill evening air. The sky was soft with the colors of dusk. He stood under a street lamp, unsure whether he had imagined it or whether Henry had truly been there. Then, just as he was about to give up, a voice spoke from behind him. "You stood tall, kid." Caleb turned. There he was, older, thinner, a little more hunched than before, but still Henry. The same gentle eyes, the same worn cap, and a smile that held back something deeper. Caleb froze, then slowly stepped forward. "I didn't know if you were still—" Henry raised a hand, stopping him. "You sent a letter," he said. "Took them a while to find me. I moved to a different home. But I read every word. Every damn word." Caleb nodded, eyes glistening. "I kept the metal safe." Henry chuckled. "Looks like it kept you safe, too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb reached into his coat and unhooked the metal from around his neck. He held it out. Henry frowned gently. "No, that's yours now." Caleb shook his head. "I want to give it back. But not to you. I want you to help me give it to someone else. When the time comes." Henry's smile slowly returned. "That's how it works, huh?" Caleb nodded. "A circle, a fire you pass on." They sat down on a bench outside the building. The world moved around them, cars, students, noise, but in their little corner of the night, time slowed down. Henry looked up at the stars and whispered, "I never thought the last good thing I'd do in this life was hand a kid a piece of old metal." Caleb replied quietly, "You didn't just hand me metal, you handed me a future." The old man's hands trembled slightly, but they were steady enough to pat Caleb's shoulder. "You proved me right, Caleb." And with that, they sat side by side again, like they had years ago. Two souls quietly connected by pain, by hope, and by a simple, selfless gift. The bench wasn't the same. The setting wasn't the same. But the feeling was. The years that followed moved faster than Caleb ever expected. He graduated with honors. His second book, Letters from the Bench, became a national bestseller, earning him a literary award he never even dreamed of. The medal, still scratched, still worn, appeared on the book's back cover, right beside a dedication. "To the man who gave me the courage to believe before I knew how to dream." Caleb stayed in touch with Henry. The visits weren't frequent, but they mattered. Sometimes they just sat and watched pigeons. Sometimes they talked about war, loss, poetry, and how the world had become noisier than either of them liked. Henry never asked for his medal back. He didn't need to. He had already seen it fulfill its purpose. One spring morning, Caleb received a call. Henry had passed away in his sleep, peacefully, without pain. The call ended, and Caleb sat still for a long time. Then he reached for the wooden box again. But this time he didn't open it. He knew what was inside, and he knew what needed to happen next. A few weeks later, Caleb spoke at Henry's memorial. There weren't many people, just a few old soldiers, some staff from the care home, and one or two neighbors who used to pass him by on his bench. Caleb read from one of his essays. Then, without a word, he placed a medal on Henry's casket, not as a return, not as a goodbye, but as a continuation. Later that year, Caleb began a program called Medals for Tomorrow, a quiet initiative, not flashy, not loud. Its mission was simple: find young people who felt invisible, unheard, and give them something symbolic, not to reward them, but to show them someone saw their struggle. A token, a story, a letter, sometimes even a medal. Each item came with a promise, written in Caleb's own handwriting. Someone believed in you before you believed in yourself. Pass it on when you're ready. And so the cycle began. Not one of medals, but a belief. of unseen hands lifting someone just enough to take the next step, a veteran's quiet act echoing through generations. Years passed. Caleb became a name many recognized in the world of literature and youth advocacy. Yet, he never chased fame. He kept his life simple: lectures, letters, books, and small handwritten notes tucked into donated jackets or under library chairs for strangers to find. But on one ordinary afternoon, as he passed a quiet city park on his way home, he stopped. There, on a worn wooden bench, sat a boy, small, alone, shoes scuffed, backpack torn at the seam. He stared down at the ground, legs swinging gently above the pavement. Caleb didn't hesitate. He walked over and sat beside him, not too close, not too far. The boy glanced sideways, nervous, but curious. After a few minutes of silence, Caleb spoke softly. "Rough day?" The boy didn't answer at first, then nodded slowly. Caleb reached into his bag and pulled out a small box. The same box, a different metal. This one donated by another veteran who had read Caleb's story and asked that it find a new home when the time came. Caleb placed it gently on the bench between them. The boy stared at it. "What is it?" he asked. "A promise," Caleb replied. "From someone you don't know to someone who might one day do something great." The boy looked confused. "Why would they give it to me?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Because someone once gave one to me, when I was sitting on a bench, just like this, when I thought I'd never matter." He stood, gently tapping the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to believe in yourself yet. Just hold on to it until you can." Then he walked away. Did the boy take the medal? Did he keep it? Did he grow up to write, or teach, or save lives? Caleb didn't know, but he didn't need to, because belief is like planting a seed in soil you'll never see bloom. And somewhere, on another bench, in another forgotten corner of the world, someone else would sit beside someone lost and begin again, with no spotlight, no applause, just a hand, and a story, and a medal, passed on, forever.